I am now on the line with Professor Knut Wettowski from New York. Professor Wettowski originally is from Germany and had a professorship or worked as a scientist in Tübingen at the Eberhard Karls University back in the 1980s. And Professor Wettowski, since when have you been working in the United States, and what is your background? If you could say a few words on this.
Okay, as you mentioned, I got my PhD and my habilitation at the University of Tübingen with Klaus Dietz, one of the leading epidemiologists who actually coined the term reproduction number.
Okay.
And so while I was there, I was working on the HIV epidemic and trying to convince the politicians and pundits that it would not spread widely within the heterosexual population. And I had to take a lot of heat for that. But now, 20 years later, we know it didn't spread. So sometimes it takes a long time for science to be acknowledged. Okay, epidemics follow certain laws of nature. And for respiratory epidemics in particular, we know they come, they peak, and they go as soon as we have herd immunity. So as soon as enough people have immunity, and then the epidemic stops because somebody who's infected cannot find somebody else to infect. And then the epidemic is over. This is how all respiratory virus diseases have ended over the last thousands, 10,000, 100,000 years. When I say the epidemic is over, I say there are no new cases reported in China anymore. In South Korea, there are 100, 200 every day at a very low, that's a very low level in a population that's almost as big as Germany's. And so there's no evidence for any health problems in South Korea anymore. In Iran, the new cases have been dropping for over a week. In Europe, they have been dropping, depending on the country, for 10 days, 2 days, 5 days, but at least for 3 days now in Europe, the number of new cases are dropping. In the United States, the number of new cases seem to have reached the peak and will also begin to drop, because it's the same laws of nature that govern the spread of epidemics all over the world.
Right.
And that's what I mean by over, because if the number of new cases is dropping, then it means the number of new infections has already declined dramatically over the last week. So typically one would estimate that the number of new infections is already down by 30% and will go down further if we have enough people who are immune in the population. Okay, we have seen some very severe forms of respiratory problems, like with the Prime Minister in Britain right now, and others that seems to be something that is unique to the current virus. It seems to cause very severe respiratory distress in some of the people who get affected. But other than that, there is no evidence whatsoever that this is any different from any other virus, respiratory virus. It's the flu during the flu season. Measures have made the situation worse. I agree.
What should one have done in the first place? So the WHO declared a global pandemic at the end of January. What should one have done as, or what would have been your advice had one of the leaders called you and asked for your opinion on how to prepare?
Done what one does with every respiratory or flu epidemic. Advise the elderly and those who are at high risk to stay at home and isolate themselves, to let the epidemic run in the population until it's over, and that is in about 4 weeks. And then they can come back. And so the grandparents cannot see their grandchildren for 4 weeks, but then they come back and it's over. Reverse what went wrong from the very first, from very early on, open schools.
So
there
it would be
no reason whatsoever for closing schools. Children are rarely feel that they are infected, and if they feel something, it's very mild. There is no, hospitals are not being overloaded with hordes of children who are there. They're being overloaded with the elderly, not with the children. And what stops every respiratory disease is herd immunity. A sufficient number of the proportion, about 8 of the population, about 80% need to have had contact with the virus, whether they know it or not. And then they are immune. To get immunity, the fastest way is to let children infect each other. And then this is how you protect the elderly from becoming infected and from having problems. So if you want to reduce the number of people who become ill, or elderly people who become ill and then may also be at risk of dying, but at least they are clogging the hospitals, let the children become infected to prevent elderly people to step in and be the targets of the virus. It was a long time ago. People were a lot more in tune with nature. Mm-hmm. So there was something, I don't know what the German word is. And here it's measles or chickenpox parties.
Yeah.
It is if one child got infected, parents would bring their children to the infected child or child that had symptoms to make sure everybody gets infected, everybody gets over it as fast as possible and with the least damage to society. That used to be common. And right now, we're doing the opposite. We're preventing an epidemic to run its course. We're trying to be to know better than nature what is good for us. And especially if it's the politicians and pundits who pretend to know better than nature. The scientists are not being heard, then it's a dangerous situation. As you have heard, scientists are not in favor of closing schools or closing businesses. Even in New York, Major de Blasio, until March 16th, he said, we will not close the schools because it doesn't make sense. On March 17th, he closed the schools. The president, a bit earlier here in the United States, said, we have never closed the economy because of a flu. And a day later, he closed it. He shut down the economy. It's these turnarounds by politicians who just listen to some pundits and are totally unaware of the science are what's causing havoc to economy and people's lives. In China and in South Korea, the lockdowns started after the peak in the number of cases, meaning that the lockdowns started as the number of new infections was already going down substantially. So it had no effect whatsoever. There are other examples. One example is Sweden. If you compare the epidemic between Sweden, who did no lockdown, and the surrounding Scandinavian countries who did a lockdown, you don't see any difference at all, indicating whatever the countries surrounding Sweden did had no effect on the course of the epidemic. So that the epidemic declines, the number of new infections and then the number of new cases and then the number of new deaths go down, is the natural course of an epidemic. It's not a proof that any interventions had any effect. We know that respiratory diseases cannot be effectively contained because the infectious period is before you have symptoms. And people can infect each other just by meeting somewhere, being in the same subway, being in the same shop, buying something, doing something that is not traceable and that is not prospectively traceable and therefore not prohibited. So we have little other options than to let the epidemic run its course. Get out. Spend more time in the outside rather than indoors, because respiratory viruses are not being transmitted in the open. They're only being transmitted within rooms, because if somebody is sneezing in the park or somewhere else, the wind is taking it away and nothing happens. So having people stay at home rather than being outside is one of the things that is counterproductive.